History often remembers weapons by the damage they caused, but some weapons are remembered for something far more unsettling, the future they almost created. Historians like Michael J. Neufeld, senior curator at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, have argued that Nazi Germany's late-war rocket programs were not simply acts of desperation, but blueprints for a new kind of warfare. Engineer Walter Dornberger himself once admitted that Germany was no longer fighting to win battles, it was racing to redefine distance itself, and no project embodied that ambition more than the A-9 A-10 Amerika Rocket, a weapon designed not for Europe, not for the Eastern Front, but for New York, Washington, the American mainland. Tonight we ask the questions most history books only mention in footnotes. Did the Amerika Rocket ever truly exist? Was it a fantasy or a prototype ahead of its time? And when the war ended, what happened to the plans, the engineers, and the fragments of a weapon meant to cross an ocean? My name is Knightley. I've spent years walking through abandoned test sites, sealed archives, and quiet museum halls, places where history whispers instead of shouts. I don't tell these stories to glorify war. I tell them because technology never dies when wars end. It migrates, it evolves, it changes hands. Tonight, I invite you to explore one of the most dangerous what-ifs of the 20th century. This is the story of what happened to the A-9 A-10 Amerika Rocket after the guns fell silent. The rise and legacy of the A-9 A-10 Amerika Rocket, the birth of a dangerous idea. Before we can understand what happened to the A-9 A-10 Amerika Rocket after World War II, we must first understand why it existed at all. No weapon of this scale emerges by accident. It is born from pressure, political, military, and psychological. By 1942, Nazi Germany had already crossed a technological threshold the world had never seen before. The V-2 rocket was operational. It traveled faster than sound. It could not be intercepted. For the first time in history, a weapon struck cities from the edge of space. But for the engineers at Peenemünde, the V-2 was not the end goal. It was a prototype. Documents and testimonies from Werner von Braun, Walter Dornberger, and later Allied intelligence reports confirm that German rocket scientists were already thinking beyond Europe. Their discussions were no longer about range in hundreds of kilometers, but thousands. The question they asked was simple and chilling. If a rocket can reach London, why not New York? Thus emerged the concept of the A-9 A-10, a two-stage rocket system designed to cross the Atlantic Ocean. The project was never officially deployed, but it was studied seriously enough to receive design resources, wind tunnel testing, and direct attention from the highest levels of the Nazi leadership. This was not fantasy. It was ambition constrained only by time, political and military motivation. By 1943, Germany was losing the war. The Luftwaffe had been broken. Allied bombers roamed German skies freely. Cities burned nightly. The Eastern Front was collapsing under Soviet pressure. Conventional victory was no longer realistic. In this environment, Hitler became obsessed with Wunderwaffen, wonder weapons. These projects were not meant to win battles. They were meant to change the rules of war itself. The A-9 A-10 fit perfectly into this mindset. It promised a weapon immune to interception, a direct strike against the American homeland, psychological shock on a continental scale. German planners understood that even a single successful strike on a major US city could force political consequences far beyond its physical damage. Fear, not destruction, was the true objective. Historian Michael J. Neufeld has noted that the Amerika Rocket represented a shift in German thinking, from battlefield dominance to strategic terror. It was the logical extension of the V-2 program taken to its extreme conclusion. Engineering vision. Strengths and limitations. Technically, the A-9 A-10 was far ahead of its time and deeply flawed. The design called for A-10, a massive first-stage booster, larger than the V-2 using clustered engines. A-9, a winged upper stage capable of guided re-entry toward a target in North America. The wings were not decorative. They were intended to provide lift and limited maneuverability during descent, increasing accuracy, a known weakness of the V-2. On paper, The rocket could reach ranges between 4,800 and 6,000 kilometers, depending on payload and trajectory. That was enough to reach the eastern United States from Western Europe. But the problems were severe. Guidance systems were primitive. Heat shielding for re-entry was unproven. Engine reliability was already a problem even for the V-2. Production demands far exceeded Germany's collapsing industrial capacity. In reality, the A-9, A-10 required years of testing. Germany had months. This gap between ambition and reality defined the project. The human cost behind the project. Like all advanced German weapons programs, the Amerika Rocket was built on suffering. The V-2 program relied heavily on forced labor from concentration camps, particularly at Mittelwerk, where prisoners worked underground under brutal conditions. Thousands died from starvation, exhaustion, and execution. While the A-9, A-10 never reached mass production, it was designed within the same system, the same engineers, the same factories, the same moral collapse. This is critical to understand. The Amerika Rocket was not just a technological idea. It was a product of a regime willing to sacrifice human lives for theoretical reach. The legacy of the A-9, A-10 is inseparable from that reality. Psychological impact, even without deployment. Despite never being launched in combat, the A-9, A-10 already had an impact. Allied intelligence became aware of German long-range rocket ambitions as early as 1944. OSS and British intelligence reports referenced captured documents discussing intercontinental designs. The idea alone was alarming. American military planners realized something uncomfortable. The Atlantic Ocean was no longer an absolute barrier. Geography, which had protected the United States for generations, was becoming irrelevant. In this sense, the Amerika Rocket succeeded without firing a shot. It forced the Allies to think differently about future war. Peak significance, a weapon that marked a threshold. The A-9, A-10 represents a moment in history where humanity crossed a line. For the first time, weapons were conceived with global reach. Civilian populations, thousands of kilometers away, became theoretical targets. Space became a pathway for warfare. Modern historians often describe the Amerika Rocket as a conceptual ancestor of the ICBM, not because it worked, but because it defined the problem future engineers would solve. After the war, both the United States and the Soviet Union would pursue the same goal: reliable long-range ballistic missiles, and they would start by studying German designs. The A-9, A-10 was not successful, but it was influential. Collapse of the old world. By early 1945, reality closed in. Peenemünde was bombed, factories were overrun, engineers fled west or were captured by Soviet forces. Fuel shortages crippled testing programs. Documentation was destroyed, hidden, or hurriedly evacuated. The A-9, A-10 never progressed beyond experimental stages. No operational units existed, no launch sites were completed. The weapon died quietly, not in battle, but in chaos. And then the world changed. Germany surrendered. The war ended. The battlefield fell silent. But the story of the A-9, A-10 Amerika Rocket was far from over, because when wars end, weapons do not disappear. They migrate. The war ends. The fate of the A-9, A-10. Amerika Rocket begins chaos of surrender and seizure. The end of World War II was not a clean conclusion. It was a collapse. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, its military infrastructure did not simply shut down. It fractured. Rocket components lay scattered across forests, underground tunnels, abandoned rail yards, and half-destroyed research facilities. Engineers fled. Records were burned. Entire programs vanished overnight. The A-9, A-10 Amerika Rocket, still unfinished, existed not as a weapon but as fragments of knowledge. Most physical components associated with the project were located in three key areas: Peenemünde, the primary research center; Mittelwerk, the underground production complex; various dispersed test and storage sites hastily evacuated during the final months of the war. When Allied forces arrived, they did not find a ready-to-launch intercontinental missile. What they found was more dangerous: ideas, blueprints, wind tunnel data, engine test results, guidance calculations, notes written in haste as the Third Reich collapsed. US and Soviet troops raced not for rockets, but for engineers and documents. Allied discovery, what was actually found. Contrary to popular myths, no complete A-9, A-10 system was ever captured intact. What the Allies recovered instead included partial A-10 booster designs, experimental A-9 winged vehicle concepts, fuel system calculations for extended range flight, theoretical trajectory models for transatlantic missions. To Allied intelligence officers, this was enough. The documents confirmed something alarming. Germany had seriously attempted to solve the problem of intercontinental missile flight. The A-9, A-10 was not science fiction. It was a failed prototype of a future reality. British intelligence summaries described the program as technically immature but strategically significant. American analysts were more blunt. This was a warning of what future wars might look like. Immediate orders: destroy, secure, or hide. In the immediate aftermath of surrender, Allied policy was inconsistent and often contradictory. Officially, advanced German weapons were to be destroyed to prevent reuse, secured to prevent looting, catalogued for intelligence purposes. In practice, these goals clashed. Field commanders lacked clear instructions. Engineers on the ground made judgment calls. Some documents were destroyed out of fear. Others were quietly shipped west. Still others fell into Soviet hands before American forces could reach them. The A-9, A-10 program suffered from this chaos. Some materials were lost forever. Others survived only because individual officers recognized their value. History often turns on such accidents. The power vacuum. A new war begins immediately. The moment Germany surrendered, cooperation among the Allies began to fracture. The United States and the Soviet Union shared a common victory, but not a common future. Rocket technology became one of the first battlegrounds of the coming Cold War. Both sides understood the implications of the Amerika Rocket. Global strike capability, strategic deterrence, political leverage beyond conventional warfare. What Germany had failed to complete, the superpowers now intended to finish. This power vacuum transformed the A-9, A-10 from a defeated Nazi project into a contested prize. Operation Paperclip and the American Path. The United States moved quickly. Through Operation Paperclip, American forces extracted key German scientists, engineers, and technicians, including many directly involved in advanced rocket concepts. Werner von Braun and his team surrendered to US forces deliberately. They understood the stakes. They chose who would inherit their work. The Americans were less interested in Nazi ideology and more interested in results. At US Army facilities, German engineers were interrogated extensively about two-stage rocket concepts, long-range guidance challenges, thermal problems during re-entry, the theoretical limits of rocket propulsion. The A-9, A-10 was dissected intellectually. Its failures were as valuable as its ambitions. Within a few years, American missile programs began addressing the exact problems the Amerika Rocket had exposed, but failed to solve. The Soviet capture, a different approach. The Soviet Union pursued a parallel path, but with far less transparency. Soviet forces seized rocket components, factories, documentation. German specialists who failed to escape west. Entire facilities were dismantled and shipped east. Engineers were relocated under guard. Research continued behind closed doors. Soviet missile designers studied German long-range concepts intensely. While they publicly dismissed Nazi technology, privately they absorbed it. The A-9, A-10 influenced early Soviet thinking about multi-stage rockets, long-range delivery systems, strategic missile doctrine. The Cold War missile race began here not in speeches or treaties, but in abandoned German tunnels. Britain, France, and the secondary powers. Britain and France also acquired pieces of the puzzle, though on a smaller scale. British scientists conducted independent analyses of German rocket research, focusing on guidance accuracy, structural design, launch infrastructure. France incorporated German engineers into its own early missile and space programs, laying groundwork that would later lead to independent nuclear delivery systems. Even smaller nations gained fragments, training data, parts, reports, each contributing marginally to the global spread of missile knowledge. The Amerika Rocket was no longer German. It had become international, from weapon to blueprint. By late 1946, the A-9 A-10 ceased to exist as a specific project. No nation attempted to build it exactly as designed. Instead, it became something more enduring, a conceptual blueprint. Engineers learned why it failed, where assumptions were wrong, which technologies were missing, what future research priorities should be. What had once been a desperate Nazi gamble was now a foundation for modern missile science. The silent transition. Publicly, the A-9 A-10 faded into obscurity. There were no victory parades, no captured superweapon tours, no museum exhibits. Behind closed doors, however, its influence deepened. Missile ranges were built, test programs expanded. New designs emerged, American, Soviet, and later others, each solving problems first identified by German engineers under wartime pressure. The Amerika Rocket never flew across the Atlantic, but its shadow did. The war had ended, the rockets were scattered, the engineers were divided, the documents were locked away. What remained was a question history still wrestles with. What happens to a weapon that never fired, but changed the future anyway? In the next section, we follow the fragments. Where did they go? Who kept them? Who destroyed them? And what traces remain today? Where did they all go? When people ask what happened to the A-9 A-10, Amerika Rocket, they often expect a single answer, a hidden launch, a secret test, a weapon lost in history. That answer does not exist. The truth is far more fragmented, because the A-9 A-10 never existed as a fleet. It existed as ideas, components, and documents, each following a different path after the war. To understand where they all went, we must follow those paths one by one. Scrapped for resources, the fastest end. The most common fate of late-war German weapons was not capture, but destruction. Europe in 1945 was shattered. Steel was scarce. Fuel was rationed. Railways were broken. Cities needed rebuilding more than museums needed relics. Anything that did not have immediate military value was melted down. Rocket parts were especially vulnerable. They were bulky, made of valuable alloys, difficult to store, seen as obsolete without complete systems. Incomplete A-10 engine casings, structural frames, fuel tanks, and test hardware were quietly scrapped by Allied field units or local authorities. In many cases, there was no documentation at all. Entire experimental assemblies disappeared into furnaces within weeks of discovery. Most physical remnants of the Amerika Rocket did not survive even 1 year after the war. They became bridges, tools, factory beams, rail lines. The weapon designed to cross an ocean ended its life reinforcing buildings in ruined cities. Captured by major Allied powers, knowledge over metal. What the Allies truly wanted was not hardware, but understanding. United States-American forces prioritized documents and people. Anything related to long-range propulsion, multi-stage flight, or guidance systems was shipped to the United States, not for display but for study. At U.S. Army facilities, German engineers were asked direct questions. Could the A-10 realistically lift a second stage? What guidance corrections were planned over transatlantic distances? How accurate could such a system ever be? The answers shaped early American missile doctrine. No attempt was made to rebuild the A-9 A-10. Instead, its failures became design warnings for future projects like Atlas and Titan. Soviet Union. The Soviets focused on replication. Entire factories were dismantled and transported east. German engineers who did not escape west were compelled to continue work under Soviet supervision. The A-9 A-10 provided conceptual validation. Multi-stage rockets were viable. Intercontinental range was achievable. Accuracy could improve with advanced guidance. While Soviet propaganda dismissed Nazi technology, internal programs quietly absorbed its lessons. United Kingdom Britain acted as an analyst rather than a builder. British researchers evaluated German rocket studies to understand vulnerabilities, not to deploy similar weapons immediately. The Amerika Rocket was treated as a case study in ambition outrunning capability. France and others. France integrated German technical personnel into its early missile and space programs. Smaller Allied nations gained access to fragments of reports and training materials. The result was diffusion. The A-9 A-10 ceased to be German. It became global intellectual property. Secret programs, where records vanished. Some materials did not enter public archives. They disappeared into classified programs. During the early Cold War, anything related to long-range missile development was automatically sealed. Documents labeled experimental in 1945 became top secret by 1947. Facilities in the United States, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, all hosted closed-door evaluations of captured German rocket science. This secrecy fueled myths, but the reality was mundane. The A-9 A-10 was not hidden because it worked. It was hidden because it pointed forward. Engineers dissected structural stress limits, fuel efficiency calculations, re-entry heating assumptions. These studies did not produce replicas. They produced corrections. Museums, why almost none survived. Unlike tanks or aircraft, rockets are difficult museum pieces. They are fragile, incomplete, dangerous if mishandled, unimpressive without context. Because the A-9 A-10 never flew operationally, it lacked historical spectacle. Museums prioritized V-2 rockets, aircraft, tanks, firearms. As a result, no complete A-9 A-10 exists today. What survives are conceptual drawings, models, reconstructed displays, educational diagrams. The Amerika Rocket lives in archives, not galleries, battlefield relics and abandoned survivors. Not everything was recovered. As German forces retreated, materials were dumped hastily, in forests, in quarries, in tunnels, in flooded shafts. Occasionally, researchers or construction crews still uncover corroded metal fragments, engine test components, structural debris. These finds are often misidentified or quietly removed. They are not treasures. They are industrial leftovers of a collapsing regime. The human trail, engineers without a country. Perhaps the most important remnants were not machines, but people. German rocket scientists dispersed across the world. Some worked for the United States, some for the Soviet Union. Some disappeared into civilian industries. They carried the ideas of the A-9 A-10 with them, refined, stripped of ideology, and embedded into new systems. The Amerika Rocket never migrated as hardware. It migrated as experience, myths, rumors, and what never happened. There are persistent legends. A completed launch site in France, a secret transatlantic test, a hidden rocket buried intact. None are supported by evidence. No credible documentation confirms any operational A-9 A-10 launch. The project died in planning, not in secrecy. What remains today? What remains is subtle. Equations reused, design assumptions challenged, problems first articulated, then solved decades later. Modern ICBMs owe nothing directly to the A-9 A-10, but they owe something to the questions it asked. The Amerika Rocket did not survive as an object. It survived as a warning that technology can outrun morality. That distance is no defense, and that even failed weapons can shape the future. In the next section, we explore how those lessons reshaped the post-war world, militarily, psychologically, and politically. Impact on the post-war world. When the war ended, the A-9 A-10 Amerika Rocket disappeared from headlines. There were no victory parades built around it, no captured missile displayed to the public, no dramatic photographs of launch sites frozen in time. Yet its influence did not fade, it simply changed form. The true impact of the Amerika Rocket was not measured in explosions or casualties, but in how it reshaped military thinking, political strategy, and cultural fear in the decades that followed. Influence on new military technology. The most direct legacy of the A-9 A-10 lies in conceptual transformation, not hardware inheritance. Before World War II, military power was largely constrained by geography. Oceans, mountains, and distance mattered. After the war, that assumption collapsed. The Amerika Rocket demonstrated, even in failure, that continental separation was no longer a guarantee of safety. Birth of intercontinental thinking. American and Soviet missile programs in the late 1940s and 1950s began with the same fundamental questions German engineers had already confronted. How do you sustain thrust across multiple stages? How do you guide a weapon beyond the horizon? How do you survive re-entry from near-space velocities? These were not invented during the Cold War. They were inherited problems. US programs such as Atlas, Titan, and later Minuteman addressed the same technical obstacles identified in A-9, A-10 documentation, but with better materials, electronics, and industrial capacity. The Soviet R-7 Semyorka, the world's first operational ICBM, followed a parallel intellectual path. Neither superpower copied the A-9, A-10 directly, but both accepted its core premise. A weapon does not need proximity to be decisive. Shift in doctrine. Traditional military doctrine emphasized forward bases, fleets, and bombers. Post-war missile doctrine emphasized launch survivability, deterrence over use, second strike capability. The Amerika Rocket represented the conceptual bridge between bombing campaigns and missile deterrence. It marked the moment warfare stopped being about reaching the enemy and became about being able to reach them at all times. Psychological impact. Fear without visibility. Unlike tanks or aircraft, rockets created a unique psychological effect. They arrived without warning. They could not be intercepted. They offered no battlefield heroics. The V-2 had already introduced this terror. The A-9, A-10 expanded it to a global scale, even if only theoretically. The end of distance as comfort for Americans, the idea that Europe could strike the US mainland, was deeply unsettling. For decades, oceans had functioned as strategic insulation. The Amerika Rocket destroyed that illusion. Even though it never flew, its existence on paper forced planners and civilians alike to confront a new reality. The next war might begin without a front line. This psychological shift influenced civil defense planning, early warning systems, and eventually nuclear deterrence strategy. Fear became abstract and permanent. Cultural memory and representation. The A-9, A-10 never entered popular culture the way the V-2 did, but its idea did. Post-war books, intelligence briefings, and later documentaries framed German long-range rocket projects as precursors to modern missile warfare. Over time, this narrative evolved. From secret weapon to failed prototype to historical warning. Science fiction of the 1950s and 1960s absorbed these themes. Long-range rockets, orbital weapons, and sudden annihilation became common motifs. Even modern video games and films echo the same fear. Weapons launched unseen, cities struck without battle, technology replacing soldiers. The Amerika Rocket helped normalize that imagination. Political effects, weapons as messages. Politically, the A-9, A-10 had influence disproportionate to its development status. For defeated nations, Germany's rocket legacy became a burden. On one hand, German engineers were instrumental in post-war technological progress, especially in space exploration. On the other, their work was inseparable from Nazi militarism and forced labor. The Amerika Rocket symbolized this contradiction: scientific brilliance, moral catastrophe. Post-war Germany distanced itself from these weapons while simultaneously benefiting from the global prestige of German engineering abroad. For victorious powers. For the United States and the Soviet Union, captured German research became propaganda currency. Each side emphasized its technological superiority, its control over the future of warfare. Its ability to prevent another such threat, or wield one missiles, replaced armies as symbols of power. The Amerika Rocket indirectly helped usher in an era where weapons were as much political statements as military tools. Influence on space exploration. One of the most ironic legacies of the A-9, A-10 lies beyond warfare. The same principles designed to deliver warheads across oceans were later used to place satellites and humans into orbit. Multi-stage rockets, guidance systems, high-altitude trajectories. These ideas migrated from military blueprints to space programs. The Cold War space race was inseparable from missile development, and missile development was inseparable from lessons learned from German rocketry, including the failed ambitions of the Amerika Rocket. The road to the moon passed through Peenemünde. Ethical reckoning and historical judgment. As decades passed, historians reassessed the Amerika Rocket not as a lost superweapon, but as a moral checkpoint. It forces uncomfortable questions. Should scientific achievement be separated from its purpose? Does failure absolve responsibility? Can technological legacy be neutral? The answer history offers is harsh but clear. Intent matters, even when execution fails. The A-9 A-10 was designed to target civilians thousands of kilometers away. Its lack of deployment does not soften that reality. Remembering it correctly means resisting both glorification and erasure. The war had ended. The rocket never flew, the plans were scattered. The engineers moved on. Yet the world that followed was shaped by the questions the Amerika Rocket forced humanity to ask. How far is too far? How fast is too fast? And what happens when technology outpaces restraint? In the next section, we turn to what little remains, the fragments, the records, and the mysteries surrounding the final survivors of the A-9 A-10. The final survivors. When people hear the phrase final survivors, they imagine machines, intact rockets hidden in bunkers or forgotten forests. But the truth surrounding the A-9 A-10 Amerika Rocket is far less dramatic and far more revealing. There are no surviving operational units. There are no launch-ready missiles waiting to be discovered. What remains instead are fragments, records, and unresolved absences, the quiet aftermath of a weapon that never reached maturity. Catalogue of what still exists. The surviving legacy of the A-9 A-10 falls into three categories: documents, models, and derivative knowledge. Archival records. The most important survivors are stored in archives rather than museums. These include engineering drawings recovered by Allied forces, wind tunnel test data, performance estimates and trajectory calculations, interrogation transcripts of German engineers after the war. Such materials are held in U.S. National Archives, British and French military research collections, Russian state archives, many still classified. These records are incomplete. Some were destroyed deliberately, others were lost during evacuation. What survives is enough to reconstruct the idea, not the machine. Concept. Models and reconstructions. A small number of scale models and conceptual reconstructions exist in research institutions, military museums, educational exhibits. These are not original artifacts. They are interpretations, built decades later using surviving documentation. They help explain intent, not capability. Technical lineage. The most enduring survivor is less visible. Technical lineage. Elements first explored in the A-9 A-10 reappear in later systems: multi-stage propulsion logic, high-altitude ballistic trajectories, separation staging under extreme stress. These ideas survived because engineers carried them forward, stripped of context, refined by better technology. Why no physical rockets survived? Unlike tanks or aircraft, rockets are poor candidates for preservation. They are structurally delicate, dangerous to store, incomplete without fuels and electronics, largely unrecognizable without explanation. The A-9 A-10 was especially vulnerable because it never entered production. There were no serial numbers, no standardized components, no deployed units worth showcasing. As a result, Allied authorities saw no reason to preserve physical remains. The historical value of the project lay in its lessons, not its metal. By the time museums began actively preserving Cold War artifacts, the A-9 A-10 had already vanished. The value of survivors today. Despite the absence of hardware, the A-9 A-10 holds significant modern value. Historical value. For historians, the project represents the conceptual birth of intercontinental warfare. The moment distance lost its defensive meaning. A clear link between World War II and the Cold War. It marks a transition from industrial war to technological deterrence. Academic and research value researchers continue to study the A-9 A-10 for what it reveals about problem-solving under extreme pressure, early systems engineering, the limits of wartime innovation. Failures are often more instructive than successes. Ethical value. The project serves as a case study in ethical collapse. Advanced science used for civilian terror, forced labor enabling innovation, progress divorced from responsibility. Remembering the A-9 A-10 correctly helps prevent romanticizing technological ambition. Auction value and private collections. There is little commercial value attached to the Amerika Rocket. Occasionally, documents or small components appear in private collections, usually misidentified or mislabeled. These items are valuable not for rarity, but for context. No verified A-9 A-10 components have ever appeared in major auctions. This absence itself is telling. The mystery of the missing pieces. Some questions remain unanswered. Were additional documents destroyed before capture? Did some materials vanish into private hands? Are there still sealed archives containing more complete records? The answer is likely yes, but not in the way myths suggest. The missing pieces are papers, not rockets. Cold War secrecy ensured that some materials remained classified for decades. Others were deemed insignificant and discarded. History does not preserve everything. It selects rumors, myths, and what can be dismissed. Persistent rumors claim a completed Amerika rocket hidden underground, a secret transatlantic test flight, a buried launch facility in France or Norway. None are supported by credible evidence. No eyewitness accounts, no recovered telemetry, no corroborating documents. These stories reflect fascination, not fact. The A-9 A-10 failed quietly and was forgotten quickly. The true survivors. If we define survivors correctly, the A-9 A-10 still exists. It exists in missile warning systems, deterrence doctrines, the fear of unseen attack. The assumption that distance no longer protects. It survives as a question history never stopped asking. What happens when technology makes the world too small for war? There are no rusting rockets to photograph, no launch pads to restore, no engines to fire again, only records, only consequences. And only the memory of a weapon that never flew, yet helped shape a world that still lives under its shadow. In the final section, we return to the present. We bring the story back to Knightley, to reflection, to meaning, and to why these forgotten weapons still matter today. Conclusion. War machines are built to destroy. That is their function, their purpose, and their justification. But history is rarely shaped only by what explodes on the battlefield. It is shaped just as deeply by what remains afterward. The story of the A-9 A-10. Amerika Rocket is not a story of victory or defeat. It is not even a story of use. It is the story of a weapon that never flew, and yet permanently altered the way humanity thinks about war, distance, and vulnerability. The Amerika Rocket did not devastate cities. It did not change the outcome of World War II. It never reached the skies over the Atlantic. But it crossed a far more important threshold. It crossed the line where geography stopped being protection. Before this moment in history, oceans mattered, borders mattered, distance mattered. Afterward, those assumptions began to erode. Slowly at first, then completely. The A-9 A-10 was not the cause of this transformation, but it was one of its earliest, clearest signals. A weapon that existed, mostly in the future. Unlike tanks rusting in fields or aircraft hanging in museums, the Amerika Rocket existed primarily as possibility. It lived in blueprints, in calculations, in conversations between engineers racing against time they no longer had. It represented what war was becoming, not what it had been. That is why it feels strangely modern even today. When we speak of intercontinental missiles, instant retaliation or deterrence measured in minutes, we are speaking a language that began forming here, in a collapsing Germany, under bombing raids, driven by desperation and ideology. The A-9 A-10 was not a triumph of engineering. It was a symptom of a world willing to gamble everything on technology when conventional power failed. The silence after the war. When the war ended, there was no dramatic finale for the Amerika Rocket, no last launch, no destroyed prototype on camera, no courtroom reckoning for the weapon itself. It simply dissolved. Its parts were scrapped, its papers were scattered. Its engineers were absorbed, interrogated, repurposed. The silence that followed is important, because history often teaches us the loud moments, the battles, the explosions, the victories, but the quieter transitions are where the future is shaped. The Amerika Rocket slipped quietly into the foundations of the Cold War. From weapon to warning. In hindsight, the most honest way to view the A-9, A-10 is not as a lost superweapon, but as a warning that arrived early. It warned that technology would outpace diplomacy, civilian populations would become strategic targets, war would move faster than human judgment. Those warnings were not fully understood in 1945. They were learned later through missile crises, nuclear standoffs, and decades of fear built on the promise that some weapons should never be used, only possessed. The Amerika Rocket helped give birth to that paradox. A weapon designed never to be fired, but always to be ready. Remembering without romanticizing. There is a temptation, especially in popular history, to romanticize failed weapons, to imagine alternate timelines, to ask what might have happened if only. But responsible memory does not ask what if. It asks, what did this reveal about us? The A-9, A-10 reveals how scientific brilliance can coexist with moral collapse, how innovation accelerates under pressure, regardless of consequence, how easily ambition can outrun restraint. It was built within a system that exploited forced labor, erased human dignity, and treated civilian annihilation as strategy. That context matters. To strip the Amerika Rocket of its origins is to misunderstand its legacy entirely. Knightley's reflection. As I walk through museums, sealed archives, and abandoned test sites, I am often struck by how quiet these places are. No engines roar, no alarms sound, no countdowns echo. Just silence. And yet, that silence is heavy with meaning. Because every drawing, every fragment of metal, every forgotten calculation represents a choice someone once made. To build, to pursue, to justify. I tell these stories not because I admire the weapons, but because I believe every relic has a voice. Some warn, some confess, some accuse. The Amerika Rocket does all three. It reminds us that the future is often born in moments of desperation, and that once ideas exist, they cannot be unlearned. What remains for us today, the A-9, A-10, exists nowhere as an object, but it exists everywhere as influence, in missile silos, in early warning radars, in treaties written to prevent catastrophe, in the quiet understanding that some technologies, once possible, permanently change the rules. The story of the Amerika Rocket is not about Germany alone. It is about the world that followed, a world where wars are planned around seconds, where deterrence replaces defense, where peace depends on restraint rather than distance. A final thought: history is not defined only by what happens. It is defined by what almost happens, and by how close humanity comes to choices it later regrets. The A-9, A-10. Amerika Rocket never flew, but it helped create a world where the threat of such weapons became permanent, and that may be its most lasting legacy. Closing call to the audience. If you want to continue this journey through forgotten prototypes, abandoned bunkers, and the silent remains of wars that still shape our present, stay with me. There are countless echoes of history left to explore. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And as always, let me know what story you want to uncover next.